Cat TV is celebrating 30 years of community media. Help support Cat TV's next 30 years by becoming a member today. Your membership will help us continue covering meaningful, local content. Thank you for supporting your local community media station.
Welcome everyone to this special meeting of the Bennington Select Board. This is February 24th. I'm Jeannie Jenkins. I chair this board. And I will ask my fellow board members to introduce themselves, starting with Gary.
I'm Gary Corey.
Hi, Tom Haley.
Good evening, I'm Jim Carroll.
Jean Connor.
Lee Clark.
Sarah Perrin. Excellent. And also with us tonight we have Town Manager Stu Hurd. We have Nancy Lively, who takes excellent minutes as always. We have Jonah Spivak, our communication coordinator on the PowerPoint. And we have Jim Byers from Cat TV on the camera. Excellent. So our main agenda item this evening is to receive the final recommendations from the Safety and Equity Task Force for a Bennington Safety Review Board. And to provide time for discussion and questions from the community and also from the Select Board on these recommendations. The recommendations have been available for comment on the town's website since February 7th, and we will continue to take written comment until March 7th. The recommendation will be on the March 14th agenda for further consideration and discussion, with a final discussion and decision to be made on the recommendations at the March 28th meeting. So there's still plenty of time to get in your comments, and we hope that you will. The group of community members who comprise this task force have worked tirelessly over the last several months. Anyone who has watched any of their deliberations, either in person or over a Cat TV video, knows how tirelessly they've worked and how carefully they've considered their charge. So I am really, really pleased that they are going to share the recommendations with us tonight. I am going to provide a format that I want to make sure we're all okay with, and then I'm going to introduce our task force for the evening. So the format, if we are agreeable, is to have the task force present, and then after that we'll take a round of questions from the board, and then we'll move to any community questions, and then we'll bring it back to the Select Board for any final questions or comments that we want to make. So if that's agreeable to everyone, then what I'd like to do is invite Margay Diamond to come up.
I'm actually going to turn it over to April.
And April Dunham. Oh, April, I was expecting you to be there. Okay, and April Dunham, who are the co-chairs for the task force to start us off. So please.
I'm inviting all the task forces to join us for a moment.
So we want to start by thanking everyone for joining us tonight to review the Safety and Equities Task Force proposal for Bennington Community Police Advisory and Review Board. I'd like to start off by having our task force members introduce themselves. I'm April Dunham.
I'm Marsh Hudson Knapp.
I'm Lynn Mazza, Gail Harbour,
Clark Adams.
Margay Diamond.
We also have a few members that are not with us tonight. Ben, I'm probably going to butcher his last name, Casanal.
Yes.
We also have Sarah Beth Ward and Laura Wilcox. Thank you.
And you have Jim Byers behind
And
the
Jim
camera.
Byers. Yes, he's hiding behind that. So great. So thank you, everybody. So I'd like to take a minute to reflect on Bennington's vision statement that is adopted by the Bennington community. Bennington is a welcoming, engaged, inclusive, and resilient community where everyone, regardless of identity, shares in our vitality and benefits from an outstanding quality of life. The goal of the task force was to further this vision by creating a collaborative relationship between the Bennington Police Department and Bennington community as a whole. Our Select Board called for the creation of a Safety and Equity Task Force to help apply this vision to the relationship between our Bennington Police Department and our community. The Board asked for recommendations for the name, scope, structure, membership, responsibilities of a community police board. We, the task force, refer to this as our charge. The Select Board set 4 areas of focus that through various trainings, discussions, and community feedback, the task force was able to adjust and make recommendations on. The areas of focus are recommendations on police training and development, police department training and community collaboration. 2, review of complaints about the Bennington Police Department. 3, development and review of the Bennington Police Department policies and procedures. And 4, analysis of safety and equity data. So why all this effort? Incidents in our community, studies of traffic stops over the course of several years, and a report by the IACP, which raised numerous other issues, nationwide concern, and to restore and improve the relationship between our police and the Bennington community as we move forward with a collaborative working relationship. Another point is that we conducted interviews with 48 community members, performed by members of the task force, along with the results of the town survey that brought a range of concerns and appreciation to the task force attention. They have urged us to take the steps that we proposed tonight. So how has Bennington responded? The Select Board arranged for an extensive review of policing by the IACP, which our town rapidly began to implement, and arranged to help us create a vision statement for our town, to coach police, and to arrange for fairness and diversity training for many members of our Bennington Police Department. The Select Board created a team of its members to guide the reform process: Bruce Lee Clark, Jeannie Jenkins, and Jean Connor. They organized civilians, members of the community, to perform a wide-ranging review of policing policies. Police leaders have been working hard to embrace community direction, concern, compliments, and increase collaboration with the many facets of our town while facing a shortage of officers. Next, our Select Board drafted the charge, which began this task force, and engaged NACOL, or the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, to provide experience input. Then they recruited and selected a diverse, committed, and hopefully talented task force, and provided 3 sessions of training on justice and local policing about justice systems and our policing policies and practices. I'll now turn the floor over to Marsh.
Thank you, April. Now, who have been the members of this task force? The Select Board recruited 10 members. You just met several of us. The group chose Margay and April to co-chair our work, and Lynn to work as our tireless secretary. Town Manager Stu Hurd and Communications Coordinator Jonas Bivik have provided very helpful help to keep us going on the track. What prepared the task force for this work? Task force members studied a wide range of resources: the IACP report, Brian Cord's excellent presentation about citizen oversight, ordinances and practices from communities stretching across America, our Bennington town vision, the charge for the task force, the timeline for our work, which has urged us relentlessly forward. Thank you. The tenets of the Bennington Police Department, their policies and procedures, a chart of officers, the internal investigation process, a chart of formal complaints, and helpful insights from Officer Ben Cassabaugh all through our work. So where did the task force begin? To start our process, task force members developed a list of our concerns and our hopes to aim for. To obtain a personal sense of both strengths and weaknesses of our present policing system, task force members interviewed nearly 50 people about their experiences, both inspiring experiences and troubling experiences with Bennington Police. We then broke into subcommittees of 3 people each to draft materials on purpose, outreach, complaint processes, etc., working between meetings and making sure to address each of the needs that have been identified. So what concerns drove our effort? Our task force has wanted to balance complaints with compliments, concerns with encouragements, so that we're not one-sided, we don't beat people down, and we don't just puff people up, but we work together in a really balanced way. Second, to ensure safe feedback for all quarters of the community and excellent listening by all the people who might receive feedback. Next, to create diverse paths so that people with varied abilities can all express their concerns and affirmations with both safety and confidence that they'll be responded to well. To establish accountable, transparent tracking and response to formal and informal input, particularly complaints. To create a board that is independent, neither dominating nor powerless in relation to the Bennington Police Department. To grow two-way police community communications, to make our police more aware of the life concerns of all of the people in our town, and to help community members to grasp the challenges and the accomplishments of our police. To help arrange and evaluate ongoing training both for the board and for the Bennington Police Department. And last but not least, as urged by the IACP, to gather and utilize data to guide our BPD and our board on a path of continuous improvement. The purposes section of our proposal defines our goals for the Community Police Advisory and Review Board, CPARB. That's the name we picked. Our 4 purposes: first, rebuilding and sustaining trust. Next, increasing levels of communication, collaboration, and even-handedness. Next, building accountability. And finally, creating an environment of respect and service between the community and our police department. What will be the main work of the board? Helping to recommend, experience, and evaluate training for our police force and our board that will support the needs of our community. Completing and implementing the vigorous system of informal and formal feedback, both complaints and compliments, that we have designed. Setting a regular calendar for reviewing policies for the BPD and submitting them to the BPD to adapt their procedures. Monitoring BPD data collection, requesting new data gathering, and reporting on the results with recommendations. Facilitating increased understanding and collaboration between police and community organizations and diverse members of the community. And based on what the board learns, making recommendations to the BPD and the Select Board for action and funding. Who will make up the proposed board? We propose that the Select Board actively recruit and select 5 to 7 members to serve 3 to 4 year terms based on the following: 8 personal attributes, particularly like a strong ability to make impartial decisions and a deep commitment to strengthening police-community relationships, residency or long-term relationship with the town, readiness to fulfill the expectations for board members for initial and ongoing training and regular presence and work with the board, seeking diversity and seeking a variety of awarenesses, experiences, skills, and/or previous trainings. And now, here's Margate.
Thank you, Marsh. So there are a few other recommendations in our report. So additionally, our recommendations cover the need for the permanent board's pretty extensive initial and then ongoing training. Covers how much such things as compensation, removal, and filling vacancies, how those would work, and identifying community resources is a big one. We really suggest that folks on this permanent board have a thorough working knowledge of our community resources. We spent the most amount of our time on this piece, the complaint process. And while it was part of our charge, it became a bigger piece because when we were doing our interviews and talking to people, we heard pretty loud and clear that there are large parts of our community that do not feel heard. Whether it's a complaint or even a compliment finding its way, the importance of finding good measures and mechanisms for the community and the police to exchange feedback and to address each other seemed a core piece of this as we move forward, especially as we move forward into contemporary community policing. We distinguished between formal and informal complaints and compliments because while formal complaints always trigger an internal police investigation, informal complaints may not. Our process for formal complaints suggests giving people a choice of going either to the BPD directly or filing through the town communication coordinator who could record it and forward feedback to the BPD and the board simultaneously. This shift would ensure people feel comfortable communicating, and it also provides a level of accountability. Anonymous complaints, of course, could be filed the same way. As Marsh mentioned, we really want to make this process accessible to people, so we'd like to have varied ways of submitting feedback, writing, recorded, online. And we'd like to think about training volunteers from community groups to assist people who need help to articulate a compliment or concern. After a complaint is filed, the police will respond following their internal investigation process. We do think a clear response timeline is essential towards gaining trust. The board would be empowered to follow up on complaints quarterly and identify trends, as well as review specific situations for consistent, fair treatment. The board is expected to review each formal complaint process and make a report confirming the findings and/or making suggestions. The board would also be using feedback, pro and con, to guide its further actions. Informal complaints. We discovered through our interviews and talking to folks that there is pretty extensive confusion about whether compliments and complaints are formal or informal. Formal complaints, when written, signed, and filed, always trigger an internal investigation. Based on what we received from the BPD on complaints over the last few years, only a few formal complaints have been processed, and there were none in 2021. That number feels pretty low in light of the IACP report and our own interviews. And so as our interviews taught us that many people who call to make a complaint think they are filing a formal complaint. So there really is very real confusion about this process. When someone from the BPD usually returns their calls, there isn't a system for tracking these relatively numerous informal complaints and compliments, nor is there a standardized response or response time. And thus the perception by many is that the feedback falls into a vacuum. The task force recommends that the community board develop a process and a timeline for welcoming and tracking informal complaints and compliments, the response and resolution of them, evaluating patterns, and assessing needed changes. We urge that the process be transparent while maintaining confidentiality. I think capturing informal feedback will provide ongoing opportunities for the board and BPD to learn and improve. What remains? We think that the new initial board should receive very similar training to what we got. And in addition, they would probably benefit from training from the Vermont Attorney General's office in making reviews and/or investigations of complaints. Developing independence of this board in reviewing and investigating BPD actions, and then fostering collaboration with BPD in other areas. The new board will need to develop task force within the board, such as focusing on feedback, data, policy review, training, and community relations. We'd like to see the development of an informal feedback tracking process so we have channels to hear from our community, and developing that formal complaint timeline and reporting process. Training community members and their volunteers to help people register their feedback, and thus helping rebuild confidence and trust from some of the marginalized segments of our community. This board is only going to be as effective as the data that it can gather. So data collection and continuous quality improvement should be an integral part of this board's work. We would like to express our very deep appreciation to the Select Board, to the town staff, Stu and Jonah, to CAT TV for broadcasting our meetings and making them accessible. And we are deeply grateful to Brian Core of NACO, who ventured up to Bennington many times to be with us in person, and most especially to our community members who shared difficult and gratifying experiences about the police interactions with us. And finally, to each member of this task force, and to the community members who have been working to support the reform process for more than 2 years, our deepest thanks. In conclusion, we hope that these proposals will bring to life the vision we collectively share for our town. We submit our recommendations and hope that the permanent board will be well positioned to hit the ground running. When we know better, we can do better. Thank you.
That was a really excellent overview. Thank you. So I want to start now with board. We're only entertaining questions around the proposal in front of us, the recommendations that have been presented just now. Anyone on the board have initial questions that they'd like to ask?
I do.
Okay, go for it, John.
On page 5, part of section 3, under expectations, letter C, it reads, active members of our police department and officers of the town government will not serve on the board until 4 years after their service is completed. I'd like to ask how you came to that, and I'm curious that, we as a board appointed a police officer to be a part of the original crew, and was there any conflict there that made you uncomfortable about that might have precluded you, fostered this idea of not allowing a police officer on the board?
Our composition task force happened to have a police officer on it, and as well as our whole task force. He was a member of the whole task force, and he was immensely helpful. And so he was in on this discussion on who to include, and particularly where we're, one of the dynamics that you may have heard mentioned in this presentation was how the police force and this task force relate to each other. Because we are hoping that there will be a very clear separation when it comes to reviewing police force behaviors and complaints. That these decisions will be made being able to draw on anything the board needs from the police department, but that the police department members won't be involved in evaluating themselves in that particular experience. Whereas in much of the rest of the work, we're really hoping for a great integration and teamwork and collaboration, because really these things are things that have to be worked on together. So, but in terms of membership in the board that would be making these reviews, that was the recommendation that they be separated. It wasn't that there were some, at least from my point of view, and the other people on the composition task force or on the whole group are welcome to comment. I don't think there was a not wanting to work with the police department or feeling like we don't want to talk to them, but there's a time to be teammates and there's a time to be separate.
Okay, just to follow up, I want to back up a little about what you said with respect to the terms of not having a police officer on the board. Where is that in here? Because I didn't read that.
Not having a police officer that you just brought?
No. About having them involved in any way.
No, that's just what I was saying, is that there would be no police officer who would be a member of the board, but certainly there would be a lot of involvement of the police force when we're talking about understanding the community, when we're talking about trying to help the police force recruit new members, when we're talking about complements and building up the police force, when we're thinking about how we gather data. All of these elements really should involve very careful cooperation. But the police would not be voting members of this board.
But as far as policy creation would?
The policy creations, this is kind of new for Bennington this year, which was the community devised the policies for the police department, and that was very different for us. And so the idea that I think we talked about was just continuing that kind of effort. And the police department would do the practices or the procedures, but the board would be engaging in creating or revising the policies.
Okay.
And might well include other members of the community in it, for sure. And I'm sure we'd want to learn from the police department in the process.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Anyone else? Yes, Gary?
When you talked about the formal and informal complaint or recommendations, do they all go through the town? I mean, will the board see all of the complaints, whether they're formal and informal?
That's the recommendation.
Okay. How often do you think this board will meet?
So the recommendation was to look at things quarterly. It's a recommendation. The intent is to try to stay on trend with what's happening in terms of feedback in the community to mitigate things from becoming a bigger deal. So if we can keep the communication flowing and we understand where there might be particular pain points, if you will, in the community, then we can be more proactive.
Yeah. Right. I had one last question.
We had some discussion about how often the board should meet, and we had a diverse amount of opinions, as we did on many things, and that was one of the great parts, I think, about our makeup, was we both respect each other a lot and actually have become good friends, at least I have anyway, and at the same time, so back to how often we meet. In terms of how often that board will meet, we really felt like the board was going to find that out for themselves. There's an awful lot to do to get started in terms of setting up subcommittees and completing the informal and formal processes for complaints and compliments. So there's a lot of training to do even before the board can start. I think if you've reviewed the training section, you can see the training is pretty extensive. So let's see, what was your question, Jim? Oh, how often it would meet. So I think we conclude, Gary, we decided that the board was going to decide that itself.
Okay. Well, I meant to start by saying this is a great document. I think you guys have done some really great work that you put together before us. The last question I had was, is there any reason that you didn't think of this being a volunteer board? That you're thinking of a board that would have compensation rather than just volunteers from the community?
I think a lot of our recommendations came from the review of other cities that have boards already in place, and most of them offer some financial recompense for their time. So we thought that that would be ideal. That's up to the budget. We spoke about, is there money in the budget for that? We heard there would be, or there could be, and so that would be our recommendation. It's a lot of time, you know, as you can imagine from what's in that document, that we're asking people to provide for a very important service. So that's our recommendation. I would just like to add also that when the question came up about would all of the complaints go through this department, I just want to clarify that this group, this board, would not be dealing with the complaints other than in a review situation. How was it managed? Was feedback provided to the person who had the issue? And it would be an oversight after the fact with recommendations if they did not agree with the findings after the complaint was submitted.
Would you make sure to introduce yourself again?
Gail Harbor.
Thank you.
So for me, the thought of composition, I'm April Dunham, by the way, before I forget, was I want to be accessible to all people. So it shouldn't come down to income-wise, if someone's losing income from a job, too. I want to be accessible to all people, you know, despite income.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Bruce.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to go back to the formal and informal complaint. I think and don't take this as a complaint by me. I'm just trying to figure out the distinction that you're trying to make. And so if someone could at least come up and see if I can have a couple of conversation, or a little bit of conversation about this. I think I understand what a formal complaint is, because that would be the kind of complaint that would be written, signed. You're asking for some, would not be anonymous. You would be asking for some specific remedy, perhaps, I don't know. But there's a particular process for that. I think I get that. Is it the case that everything else, or anything else, would trigger would that be an informal complaint? Anything other than formal? Is that how it's being defined by you?
That's a pretty good way of determining it. The formal complaint would be either written or recorded or submitted online.
Right.
And that would make it formal, unless the person says, this is just an informal complaint. The informal complaints, the police department, we looked at the record if some of you have seen too, the record of complaints, and like last year, there were no complaints. So we got thinking, well, of course there are complaints. I mean, we haven't gone to heaven yet. So what happens to all those? And they are responded to, many of them, but there's been no tracking process to see, well, are there 100 people who are complaining about issue A, or is there one person having a bad day, or what's the nature of these, and do they all get responses? There was some concern that some people failed to get responses, and if the board is going to be keeping track of and working together with the police, they kind of have to know what's the feedback from the community. So we're really trying to encourage a lot of feedback. But you're right, Bruce, the basic distinction is if people file and sign an official complaint, that's the formal complaint, and everything else is informal.
Yeah, okay. And is an informal complaint essentially the same as informal feedback?
Yes.
Which was a term found all of a sudden new on page 12.
Yes.
The only difference is informal feedback.
If you're going to talk, you actually have to be at the microphone. And then give your companion a share. Thank you.
So my name is Lynn Mazza. Feedback can be either a complaint or a compliment. So feedback is just broadly anything that somebody wants to communicate to the BPD. What we were finding was that, again, to kind of go back on what Margay was saying, in a lot of the interviews, people called up and they would talk to somebody and think that they had filed a complaint. And then when there was no evidence of this complaint anywhere and no feedback returned, they said, hey, what happened to our complaint? So there was just a lot of just confusion in the community about what a complaint process is and what to expect when they either filed the piece of paper as a formal complaint or when they did an informal phone call or email or conversation with somebody face to face. There's nothing to track those. And so when we're talking about data, it's really hard to know what's going on if we don't know what the nature of these informal calls and emails and things might be. And some of it might be just day-to-day kind of flippant stuff, but there might be a pattern there. And the fact is, we just don't know. And if we don't know, then how do we proceed? How do we address things? And that's kind of what that informal complaint process was kind of getting at, is how do we capture and track this information so that we can act on it if we need to?
Okay, thanks. I have one or a couple more, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
On page 2, you talk about the CPARB serves as an independent board that works in collaboration with the town of Bennington, the select board, and the police department, and community partners and the public. I'm trying to figure out what we mean, whether we mean anything formally by the word independent. It seems to me that it's an important word, but I'll tell you what my misgiving is. As a member of the select board and elected by the people of Bennington, I'm somewhat responsible for, and my colleagues are responsible for, pretty much the business of the town, for good or for ill. And I'm wondering what the term independence is getting at, because I'm not sure that you can be independent in the formal sense. You may be independent in the more colloquial sense, and I'm just trying to get at which that is, or if there's another version of independence that I just would love to know about.
Great question. And all of our discussions about independence are about the relationship between the board and the police, rather than between the board and the select, between the CPARB and the police. That the CPARB is independent of the police department, but not independent, obviously, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but not separated from the, well, we are separated from, the board is separated from the select board. But there isn't some kind of, the board is accountable to the select board and reports to the select board, and the select board will be evaluating its proposals and recommendations, but that's what independence means. Does that make sense, Bruce?
Yeah, and that would have been really helpful to have said, but that's okay. I now get it.
That's why we have you asking questions. We knew there'd be things that we wouldn't answer.
I know. It's perfectly okay.
I got a couple.
You cannot be carrying on conversations off mic.
I'm on mic. Hi,
Oh, now
I'm
you are.
sorry. Now I am. I wasn't. I apologize. Scale Harbor again. I think we were using the phrase independent to mean not under the influence of in any kind of decision they made regarding to a review or a recommendation they were making.
Thank you. That's actually, that's very helpful. Thank you. I just have one other, well, I have a number of other places,
Well,
but I have one
yeah.
other question if I can.
Okay, do one more.
Just
and then
for
to
clarity's
Jean,
sake.
And then, yeah.
On page 5, again, under expectations, it's E. Can you clarify for me how many meetings I can't be a member of the board anyway, but if I were appointed member of the board, how many meetings could I miss in a year and not be considered as resigning? Is there a specific number, or is there some way of determining it?
Yeah, it depends on how many
read that
meetings there are, but it's, you know, if there are 10 meetings, then 3/4 of the meetings would be more than 7, right, or more than 8 or more. It would depend on how many meetings there are. But the vision was that people would be really dedicated to being present and working. And if when people are regularly absent, then it would be considered that they weren't committed, and that could then bring it to the place of considered for removal.
Trust me, I agree with that
Yes.
theory completely.
But there's no number set. We didn't.
And 75%, where did that number come from? Because that seems remarkably high to me.
It came from our, do you think of it, did you have any idea about that?
That's all right. Thank you. Just seems high.
Really?
Yeah, if you're missing three-quarters of it.
No, they must
No,
attend.
you had 10, 75%.
Okay, sorry, I'm just reading that just the opposite.
Okay, I'm Clark Adams, and I remember the heated discussion on that. And as my peers have said, the most important part is we wanted someone who is actively engaged in participating with the process. And I speak from somebody who, as they know, have a job that often sends me off to Alaska for weeks on end. So, we've done things over Zoom and phone and so forth. So I think the critical element there is not really the number, the idea. This person is there. They talk about unexcused absences. Somebody who blows it off, do you really want that person involved?
No, I don't. You're
Okay.
right. Sorry, I apologize.
Okay.
Thanks. I also had that question about multiple. And those of you that know me know I really love clarity, and the multiple word was problematic for me too, because it's open to interpretation. And I think there's several places where the select board can, really hone it down and pin down hard numbers or use different language to clarify. I had a question on page 6, and it was
You're raising one good question that came up that we haven't talked about, which is unexcused, and exactly who does the excusing. And as we talked about it in our subcommittee, the idea was that we were accountable to each other. So if somebody calls in, the group wouldn't evaluate the excuses, but we'd expect people to reach out and say, I can't be here, rather than to just waltz off and not be there. But, what's the level of excuse that would be tolerable? We didn't decide that we should be evaluating that.
no one's questioning the intent. It's just, I think it needs to be clarified on what the number would be. And the question I had on page 6 is number 7, the number of members. I'm wondering how you came to the conclusion that 5 to 7 was a good number. I understand the odd number, that I get, but 5 to 7 seems small, but you guys have done more research on this than I have, and Brian's here too. So I guess I'm just curious why 5 to 7.
Again, Clark Adams here. I think that number was those numbers were arrived at based on our experience with even this board that we're on being formed. That the most important part is here we are looking for people who are willing and able to be active participants on a regular basis. Our thoughts were based on just the difficulty in recruiting. I think 14 people applied to be on this committee we're on, that we really thought that would be a more realistic number of people to seat. We could ask for 20 or 21. Would we have gotten 21? I think my peers agreed we probably wouldn't. So we listed a range that we thought was more obtainable than anything else. And as I don't think we've had many people even show up at our meetings. So I think we're right on point by asking for a realistic number of people to sit on the board.
Okay. The other question I have was on page 7, and it's number 1, the initial training. The training is rigorous, and as it should be. Did you guys toss around any ideas on who would do the training? Or
I know that's not your responsibility. I was just wondering, through your research, if you came up with some ideas of who would actually do the training for the board.
Hi, I'm Lynn Mazza. We don't have a comprehensive list of it, exactly, but I did have a really interesting conversation with Julio Thompson from the Attorney General's office. And he said that they're aware that towns all over the state are engaged in these kinds of processes. And he said the state is actively developing trainings to provide to the towns. And he also said that they're really, really interested in feedback from committees like CPARB or boards like CPARB on what kind of trainings they want as well. So is there anything definitive right now? No, but there are a lot of really hopeful possibilities, really exciting possibilities, I think.
Good to know, thanks.
Oh, and I just wanted to add one thing. I know that throughout this document, there are some vagaries in there. Some of those were put in there purposefully because we didn't want to paint the new members of this next board into a corner, so to speak. We wanted, like with the scheduling stuff, we wanted, recognize that they know their schedules better than we ever could, and they could know what would work. So we didn't want to get really into a lot of deep specifics on stuff and really, like I said, paint them into a corner.
Yeah, I understand that. Can I just, this is not really a question, it's sort of a comment, but like the complaint, formal, informal, it would be really great, and we can add those, is definitions of what they are, for clarity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our hope this evening is to get as much of your back thinking on this as we can, so that as we're reading it, we understand why you left it the way you did, or why you were explicit where you were. Okay, anyone that has not asked a question on the board that would like to ask a question? All right, I think I have a general one that and it goes back to the question of independence and still keeping an ongoing healthy relationship with the town, with the community, with the police department, select board. And I don't know if this is a question for the task force or if it's actually a question for Brian, but I'm just wondering, how most boards sort of do that balance of retaining independence, but also having the resources as part of the meetings. And, is it usual to have a staff liaison from the town or the select board? Is it usual to have the police department chief or his designee come in and give a report at the beginning of the meetings? Just sort of what's the general flow? And I don't know who's better to answer that. I mean, I'm looking at Brian because I'm thinking that might be in your bailiwick, but because I think for all of us, we're trying to envision what this is. So
All right, well, thank you. I'm Brian Corr from the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, past president, and live and work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm the director of our civilian oversight agency, the Police Review and Advisory Board. So I guess in a general sense to your question, I would say that you really want to be independent in terms of judgment. You want to be advocates for fair process and outcomes, not advocates for complainants and not advocates for the police or the police department. Obviously, boards like this are created because of community concerns, because of issues, whether they're specific or general. And at the same time, those boards, if they're sitting in any way, shape, or form in judgment, must be able to be fair and impartial. So often when people talk about independence, the two areas they mean are really independence from the police department, because there are various models where there's sort of a community advisory group or people providing input to the chief, but it's really for that chief or for the police department. The other piece is, I would say it's less common in smaller communities, but when you're in large municipalities, there can be a real concern that you have pressure because you're all part of the same municipal government, and so as agents of that government, how do we ensure that we are independent in our judgment while still being part of and accountable to the broader municipal government. So I think that's actually not that hard to do, but it often seems complicated on the front end. And it really is about clear lines of responsibility and authority and clear standards around how you make your decisions, what you're looking at, the processes that you use. So I think I answered all of your questions, Madam Chair.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, and I think Jean had-
Brian, stay there for a minute. And you guys can obviously speak to it too. Since none of us have been through this before, in communities where boards have been put in place, how has the dynamic developed between the police department they're overseeing and the board? Does it become divisive? And how do we avoid that? Or is it, everybody singing Kumbaya? I don't know, or somewhere in between.
Well, the short version is it varies. Right now there are over 200 civilian oversight entities in the United States. A lot of those have been formed in the last 10 years. So there's a whole range of models and relationships and situations they've been formed in. I would say in general, where we've seen tensions is where I hate to say it this way, but people start to feel at their sides. We're the community side, we're the police side, and we've got to defend our side. And so the best way to avoid that, I think, is really ensuring that all through the process, which I think Bennington has done admirably, all of the stakeholders are at the table. That you've got people, from the community broadly, community activists, people who are not active but are just members of the community who have a concern, people who are involved in the police department, part of the police department, and that you're ensuring that everyone has a real voice, right? So that it's not just window dressing or we checked off a list, but that all of those voices are present at the table. Now again, when you're talking about municipal governments and systems, it's a little more complicated. So it may not be that you have members on the board, say, who are police officers, and that's a pretty common thing in oversight because of the perceptions of conflict of interest or how can this group be fair. But that means you also have to make sure that you do have involvement and engagement with the police department and doing that collaboratively. And the last thing, because I could go on about this for hours, the last thing I would say is that in practice, it really is about being collaborative. You have to be independent while still being collaborative. And my own agency in Cambridge, we have what many people in oversight always want, subpoena power. We haven't used it in well over 2 decades because we have a collaborative relationship. I work with the police department. We understand that we have a shared goal. We want to live in a safe, peaceful, and just community. And so we don't always agree on the details. We may not always agree on the findings of an investigation, but we do agree on the principles and that we all have that same goal. So that allows us to be collaborative and to see each other as colleagues who work independently, but yet collaborate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, sorry, in April, Dunham again, if I haven't announced myself, as Marsh had pointed out earlier, that we've had lots of rich discussions. Sometimes we agreed, sometimes we didn't, but we really had that group adhesiveness throughout this whole thing. Every member, and this is probably the one thing that I speak, very strongly about, is that we all had the same view that this really is going to be a collaborative board. We don't want it to be punitive against anybody in our community, against the police department. We want it to be collaborative. So it shouldn't feel like it's us against them, but it should make us all feel, like, kind of as Brian said, that we're all in for the same goal. So I just think that was really important to point out. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Lynn.
My name is Lynn Mazza. At the risk of being redundant, I'm going to kind of dovetail to what they said. A lot of people think that police reform or community policing is about kind of like playing gotcha with the police and finding that one like bad officer and weeding them. And that is so far from the spirit or the intention of any of this. This is really about helping find ways to support the police and making the whole community better. It's not about playing gotcha, and it's not about putting the smackdown on anybody at all. So I just want to make that really clear, that this whole thing is really in the spirit of what do the police need? And one of the interviews that was really moving to me was a story of an officer who was sent out to somebody who was right in the middle of a suicidal crisis and armed. And I thought, oh my goodness, they sent this guy, this 30-year-old guy with no training, out to deal with somebody in a suicidal crisis? You know, and that was for me was a really big flipping point to say, we really need to find ways to support our officers and to give them the real training and the real support that they need to really deal with these crazy situations that they're sent into. So that's my little 2 cents, and I know that that's off track, but I had to throw it in.
And I'm Marsh Hudson-Epp, and we, in our interviews, both with individuals and in our discussions that included a police officer, we learned a lot about the needs of the community and a lot about the needs of the police officers in the police department. And one evening of our training, the police chief and lieutenant spent talking with us about how things function, some of the happy things and challenging things about the police department. It was really good for us to learn about our police department because we had a lot to learn, and our community has a lot to learn about the challenges and strengths. And in the interviews that we had with our, I think there was 48, but nearly 50 people, we heard some really inspiring stories about the way our police department is right on the money, are inspiring, are empowering persons. And we heard some situations that, as they were reported to us, were very troubling also. And so developing this kind of really rich feedback process where we aren't trying to blame people, but where the board is trying to really understand the full dynamics of all the strengths we have and the challenges we have, and then work together as community and police and town to do the best we can with all of them. That's our hope.
Jeannie, I've got a quick question.
Well, so what I'd like to do is, we've all spoken here that have initial questions. I'd like to turn it to the to the community, and then bring it back to the select board. Will that wait? Can you wait?
I think we can address it quickly. I just wanted to know when Lynn mentioned that police officer, was that a Bennington police officer?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, clarifying question. All right. So what I'd like to do now is to give the community an opportunity to speak. We're going to use the same format we use for public comment, which is 3 minutes. It needs to be something that that is helpful for all of us to hear. And I will rule you out of order if it is not on this topic. So the questions and comments need to be on these recommendations. With that, Kevin, I'm going to give you the floor.
I was going to say, you're looking right at me, Jeannie. I appreciate that. My name's Kevin Hoyt, born and raised native Vermonter, candidate for Vermont State Governor. I want to thank the Select Board, and you guys do a fantastic job. I've got some questions, so I'm going to try to maintain that 3 minutes. Do you guys have the power to investigate, suspend, and arrest? No, you don't. I don't think that's a coincidence. Just like I don't think these guys want to make sure we're in part of this, right? So again, we're here tonight to talk about to improve the strength in police-community relations by creating an environment of trust and transparency. I don't have any trust. I don't think you guys are transparent. I've got a page full of felony crimes by these guys that are law enforcement.
Kevin, please keep it to the recommendations.
Okay, I want to talk about Chad Schmidt. Right?
No, you're out of order, Kevin.
I'm out of order. He's just reported,
Stuart,
gone from his post for two years. He dissolved all of his business, right? You guys lied, right? Do we get an apology from the Bennington Select Board, from Bennington Town Manager Stu Hurd, from Lloyd Dean?
Kevin, you are out of order.
I'm out of order. All right, you want to talk about our Bennington police? How come our police chief is on restrictive duty and he doesn't have a badge all the time? We've got all these things and there's never any agenda
Officer, could
to
you
talk
please
about
escort
it.
Kevin out?
How about the Vermont Sheriff's Association that's got a matching EIN number with Judge Colvin's nonprofit, the Mount Anthony Preservation Society? And again, the society of shell companies that we have, you guys sit on all the boards. Out of order. I'm calling for the immediate resignation of Sheriff Chad Schmidt and every one of you, and it better be on the meeting minutes. Thanks, Mr. Harrington. Appreciate it. I appreciate what you do. And I back the blue, by the way. Again, running for government, I would, I forgot my notes, thank you. I would actually give the money more the police more money. I wouldn't defund the police like you guys did, because I believe in proper equipment, training, and I respect that. I don't have any respect for you guys, and you weren't elected, right? The
Your
election
time is
fraud,
up.
where's the letter from the Secretary of State? You guys were supposed to do it. I know, Ross, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we all take a deep breath.
Sorry about that.
Again, sorry about that. All right, so Nancy, please come on up to the podium.
Hi, Nancy White, Bennington. I appreciate all the work and time and effort and thought you put into it. I have a huge issue, since I've been bringing up since December, that the citizens of Bennington were denied the right to ask questions and get answers while you're working. Those of us who live here, we pay the town budget. We pay the budget for the police department. We have a police department to keep our town safe. In these 12 pages, I read nothing that's really going to happen to help make Bennington safe or get us safer. I'm very disappointed that we haven't heard from the chief. If there's anything in here that's going to cause us to lose officers or make it harder to recruit, it needs to be removed. I think there's good ideas in here. I think there's things that aren't necessary. This committee will be appointed by you, not elected by the citizens. We can't hold them accountable for their actions. They're looking to get paid as members of the select board. A lot of money going to be needed for training, I believe. With all this training I'm reading, I don't really know what it's for and where the money's going to come from. Possibly you're going to need interpreters. Will you need lawyers at any point?
I'm Lynn Mazza. There was a question about whether or not we would have access to the town's lawyer, but I'm not uncertain about that.
Okay. Another concern I've raised since December, what is the budget? At one of your minutes in the meetings I read, you said if you're going to need money, the select board needs to know to get it in the budget to get voted on. There is no money in the budget for this. Stu confirmed it. This budget starts in July and goes to June of '23. The committee will need budget, will need money. Where will the money come from?
Nancy, I'm sorry, are you finished with your comments?
No,
because I think the task force probably would like to respond to some of them. I'll let you guys go first if you would like. Are you finished?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, continue and then people can respond. So, yeah, okay.
Let me just see where I was. It appears that the select board really won't be dealing with the police department. Will this be handed off to the committee and that will be, the police department will be their responsibility? What will you have left that you'll be doing with the police department?
Are you at the end of your questions?
Question, yes.
Okay, so would someone from the task force like to
No,
begin? Sure, Clark.
I'm
Go
asking
ahead.
what the select board
Nancy, no, this is a hearing, this is a special meeting to look at the recommendations that the
Okay.
task force has put together, and they are the people who will respond first, okay? So Nancy, why don't you take a seat and then Clark can
Well, that was a lot, but start off with the easy part in my mind. There has been, from what I've witnessed, a complete lack of any public attendance or questions being posed to our meetings. I can stand here to say that I've never heard anything that prohibited or disincentivized the public from attending and addressing their concerns with the meeting. So I apologize that maybe you didn't get the memo, but I think we had open at least 10, 15 minutes reserved for every meeting for public comment. And I think the most people I've ever seen in the room were 2, and neither of those people spoke up.
We weren't allowed to speak.
Oh, well, again, and I didn't know who they were, but I'm just saying that I don't understand where that comes from. The issues of budget, I don't think we entered into that other than the fact that if the town needs a service, and, you know, to be simplistic, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So, you know, if it's important enough for the community, it's important enough to find the money. In terms of police department oversight, I think that was something we all made it quite clear that we believe this committee's role is not to supervise or direct the operation of the police department. I believe the role of this committee will be to review complaints and decisions and review how and why those decisions evolved to either issue a concurrence or non-concurrence with those. I had someone stop me one day and mention to me they thought that was going to be the role, that they were going to run the police department. I let that person know, absolutely not. It is not our intention, or will this committee's operations to be running or supervising the police department. We are, in my mind, creating a task force that will serve as an extension of good governance by the elected representatives of this town. I think I answered your questions.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Clark. I will just add, all town boards and commissions have access to the town's attorney as needed. That, you know, that works through our town manager. But yes, of course you do. So anyone else would like to speak? Yes.
My name is Kelly Carroll, and I'm a lifelong, well, not lifelong, since '69, I've been a resident of Bennington. I want to thank the task force and the select board. And I encourage you to think about it and to move forward with the process. I'll be the first to say I was not at any of the meetings, shame on me. I think that any time that we can do something that's going to increase transparency, build trust, and take a look at getting that communication going so that people can understand. You know, we talk, you know, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I certainly do not know what other people experience, but you hear that you don't know what you don't know. So I encourage you to go forward with it, because I really do think that if we can just get a lot of that education out, and I think as far as, you know, expense, if it's worth doing, it's worth funding. I have no idea what we're talking about on dollars, but I encourage you to put the training in, because the story about the 30-year-old officer going on the suicide call, it really should be one of those aha moments for everybody to say, hey, everybody needs to have more training, because nobody knows what we don't know. So I encourage you to take that and take a step towards transparency, building trust, collaboration, and thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nancy? This is not, be careful about it. Be careful about it. If you have additional questions, please go for it. But this is not to be a one and back.
I don't want it to be a back and forth. I want to clarify. Before the committee started, the public was told we could attend the meetings and observe. We couldn't speak. So I said, what's the sense of going? And I didn't realize until December, and I came here and spoke to you about it, that we could make comments at the end. And I said, a comment isn't the same as being able to ask a question and get an answer. And at the end of your meetings, it said comments. Now, if it said question and answer, I would have been at every meeting.
Well, Nancy, they were also taped on CAT TV, so, you know, I think that would have been really clear. It was on the agenda. I remember Jean being quite eloquent in speaking about the fact that we encourage people to come and watch. You could comment at the end. There was 10 minutes set aside at each meeting. So I'm sorry for that misunderstanding, but
Okay,
you know,
well,
it's
and again,
done.
I'm concerned about the timing. As I said in December, we had a right to know all the details and the costs before town meeting, before we vote. And I would urge citizens to get out and defeat the budget and have you tell us actually what you're going to do in March.
So Nancy, you're starting to stray. So if you have any other questions, so we have we have Brian Core, who's driven here from Cambridge, Mass.
And I
to be with
appreciate
us.
it.
We have virtually the
Jeannie,
entire
Jeannie,
task force here.
I
Please ask
appreciate what they've
questions.
done, but as a citizen, I feel that we were cut out of this process for 4 months.
Again, that's your opinion. Thank you for your opinion.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else that would like to have a comment? All right, so let's move it back to us. Select Board, any other questions that we might have while we have all this good expertise in the room? Yes, go ahead.
This may be for Brian, I'm not really sure. Whatever this final document turns out to be, and we've got an incredible document here to absorb and work on. So whatever that turns out to be, and I imagine it will change a bit here and there, is it true that it will possibly evolve over time as things change in the community? Maybe we don't need to do some of these things that are, I'm just thinking that probably is going to happen, and hopefully that's a good thing. So is that true, Brian, or? You can just shake your head. Okay, no, it's fine.
Well, no, I don't mind the walk, and through you, Madam Chair, very quickly, I guess I would say, in my experience, every board like this does evolve over time. I mean, when you have a process like this where you really have engaged the community in a deep listening and thinking process, you come up with your best ideas, strategies, tactics, some very detailed things, and then turn that into a charge for a real board. And then you have to live into it. You have to see how it works. And there are some oversight boards that have been around for decades with very little change, but almost every oversight, civilian oversight entity does change, whether it's by ordinance, whether it's by adopting rules and regulations and updating them. And then also the situation changes, the community changes. The nature of policing in certain ways will change in a community. So I would say that you start off with the best that you can, you pay attention to it, and every couple, 3 years, you should really be thinking pretty carefully about how is this working? Is it meeting the specific goals that it was set out to do, and is it more broadly meeting the goals and needs of the community? And when I say, I mean the entire community.
So perhaps that's something we should add, is review of this document over every few years.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it could be similar to, say, a charter review for a town, where you know obviously the big purpose for having a town, but you're really looking regularly at, is the structure, is the work that we're taking on the best way for us to continue to meet the needs as they've evolved today?
I've got a question, and this is more for Stu. And insofar as, let's say there's a complaint that comes before this board, would that complaint, if there was some question about its validity, wouldn't that first be adjudicated by the board and then perhaps handed off to this committee, or vice versa?
It would, under Act 56 and part of this document, which I think has actually been very well prepared, the investigation is performed by the police department. If the police department finishes their investigation, and this document recommends very specific timelines for those kinds of investigations, this new committee would review the police department's report. If it agreed with the report, fine, and we're done. Whatever actions the police department takes to resolve the complaint. If it disagrees, then it has the authority, in some cases through subpoena powers, but in other cases through collaboration, to go back and ask for more information from the chief. Why didn't you look at this? What would you look at this? What do you think about this? And until the committee believes and agrees with the findings of the police department. At no time does it come to you.
No, we were an interim board in until another board. There's
Act
also the
Act
opportunity
56 does
to take it
require
off, right?
a citizen review. Historically, that has been the town manager's office. For a very short period of time, it was the select board. You took over that authority. And in many towns, the select board is the review board. In this case, we are suggesting that we create an independent, impartial review board, taking that authority off of your shoulders and letting that group carry that burden.
Can I add to what Sue's saying? This is Lynn Mazza. So after the police would do their investigation, CPARB would review it and have a conversation about that. And then they would release their recommendations to the select board. And then ultimately it's for the select board to tell Chief Doucette if he has to take a particular action, the select board would do that based on CPARB's recommendations.
And I think, and this might be a place, Brian, where I'm looking at you again. I mean, it feels to me like this is new territory for this board to think about. And so what that actual process is may depend on state law. It may depend on, what I'm not sure that is exactly the way that it actually has to flow or should flow. But the idea is that you guys, the CPARB, which stands for Community Police Advisory
Review Board.
Thank you, Review Board. So it means that CPARB would be that review board, and then it would go on to next steps, whatever those next steps are.
Currently, under the charter, the manager would be the one that would be required to take an action, especially if it involved personnel.
Okay. Were you on the
Yeah, I
same
wanted to
topic?
back up just for a minute too about I guess we didn't literally put in the report that we expected that this would all change, or much of this could change, any of this could change. You know, we've created something by looking at lots of models from across the country and using our own life experiences and creativity, but we haven't done this before. So we kept saying at meetings, the select board is going to be reviewing this, maybe changing it in smaller, big ways, and this group is going to start out on their adventure, and they're going to learn a lot, and they're going to find, whoa, boy, that doesn't work. Have we created some things that have so much bureaucratic nightmare that we don't, the group won't want to do it? Or are they going to find that there are areas that we haven't dealt with? There are a couple of areas that we've talked about and didn't really work out extensive, like data. We were really fortunate to have Gail on our task force, and Gail has done a lot of work in healthcare with continuous quality improvement and working with healthcare institutions, taking feedback, both critical and affirmative, and working with it and trying to keep on improving all the time. And so her talking with us, talking with me anyway, has inspired me. This seems like a wonderful model for how we want to relate to the police department. So we want to keep helping things to improve, and we don't know what that's going to all be. We particularly don't know what kinds of data collection and evaluation that would be really good. And one of the things that Gail agreed to do was to offer to work with the CPARB to help them with data, with the whole data process. And I hope that will be something that will be followed through. Another thing is in the whole area of training, that we know that it's really important for the board. I don't know if you heard all the words of it, but they're both to look at what's happening, to evaluate what's happening. Like in some of our discussions with our police officer friends, in their opinion, some things are really helpful, and some things they've had trainings and they've memorized the answers, and they really need situational opportunities to work on integrating the concepts that are coming in their training. And one of the suggestions is that the board members participate in some of the training so that they taste and see what it's like really. And all that's going to unfold into something that we don't know what it is yet. So we were really hoping for and expecting a lot of change to come.
Thank you for that.
Thanks, Marge.
There's I think the critical word that we all need to keep in mind addressing a lot of the questions that have popped up is the word review. You know, CPARB is not an operational or managerial or directive organization. It takes data in. Our plan is it takes data in, it looks at that data, provides a series of recommendations or guidance to the town board to act upon it. And, you know, touching on the issue of, you know, a non-concurrence. CPARB, in my mind, can report a non-concurrence. They don't have to concur, you know. You express your non-concurrences to the town board, and the town board looks at your non-concurrences, and then, as the operational managerial side of the community, go to the appropriate agency and say, hey, you know, we've got this information. It doesn't look like what you presented tallies up with expectations. But I think the most important part is, and I mentioned earlier, I want people to understand, in my opinion, the CPARB is not an operational managerial oversight entity. It's a review organization looking at data, the facts, and objective findings based on policies and the legal standards within the state.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Oh, Gary,
One
good.
question. Stuart, I thought I heard you say that they had subpoena power, but is that?
Some do.
Oh,
No.
some do.
Yes.
This one doesn't suggest that, is that correct?
Cambridge committee does have subpoena power, but as Brian has already told you, they haven't used it in decades. So, yes, some do.
But this one doesn't.
They're not recommending that at this time.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions from the
One
board?
more, but I feel like I'm monopolizing the
All right. You have another question?
Yeah, but I feel like I've spoken enough.
Do you want to do, well, you can.
Is it okay?
You can be the final.
Okay. Oh, I don't want to end it on this note. Someone has to say something really wonderful after me. Okay. There was one part of this that I guess I would use the word concerns me, and it's on page 3, at the top of the page, letter F. And again, I've never done this before. You guys know way more about this than I do. But is it customary for boards to investigate and interview witnesses? Yeah, no. Okay.
Not without an investigator.
Yeah, okay. So that's why I didn't want to end on that note.
Okay, so what we can end on, though, is that this is fantastic work. And I think it does feel like this has been a community endeavor that the task force has led us in. You guys have invested deeply in thinking about these questions. And the community, we will get feedback from the community, which will be shared with the task force and the select board. I think, you know, we'll see where that takes us, and I don't anticipate having another formal meeting, but we'll see where it takes us. And then we'll have an opportunity to address and have additional conversation on the 14th, which will be after the written comments are in. So I think we will have heard most of the thoughts in the community that are going to be expressed. So my hope would be that all of you would come back for the meeting on the 14th, on March 14th, where we take this up so that we can have more discussion. Because I think at that point, we'll probably get more down in the weeds and in terms of, you know, what's possible, what's not possible, and other thoughts that we might have. Is that
huge thank you from the community, from us, on just incredible work that you guys did. Watched every minute of it, and it was truly amazing.
It was great.
Really amazing.
And I have to say that as a human being, watching select board members masking tape their lips sealed while they were watching and wiggling in their chairs and not interfering in the slightest or telling us what to do or, you know, it was really, yeah, I was admiring your self-restraint.
It was fun watching you guys grapple. It was.
Yeah.
And still is. Okay, so with that, I think we will end this agenda item with our sincere, deepest thank you.
Yes.
And we speak for the entire community. The entire community owes you a debt of gratitude.
Let's give
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we'll give it a minute because we have a 5-minute agenda item and then we have a need for executive session. So Shannon, let's give them a sec to
Sure.
be able to stretch their legs.
And tell them to have a great night.
Never limit time. It's done on any other limits. That's it. Jim, you get this straightened out when you're
Tiffany Tan did a hatchet job on Chad Schmidt. Hatchet job. And his family is in Tennessee, living in Tennessee. Kids are going to school there. He's leaving the sheriff's department at the end of his term and moving to Tennessee. That's all wrong. She brought up every allegation that should be careful. You know, every allegation. She found certain school districts, kids are registered in the school.
Hi.
Oh, no, I mean, I think that's not what is what?
Thank you, guys.
Oh, okay. Come to find out, Attorney General's office and State Secretary said you didn't have one in the state.
It is, it's sort of, it's the ascension of, yeah.
Right.
Shannon, thank you for your patience.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. All right, so next up, we have a resolution for the Downtown Transportation Fund application. And Shannon Barsati, our Community Development Director, is here to talk with us about that.
Great. Well, thanks for accommodating this request at a special meeting tonight. As many state grant applications require a select board resolution before applying, and this is the case for the Downtown Transportation Fund. And town staff right now are preparing the application, which is due to be submitted on March 7th. That's why I'm here tonight asking for your approval of the resolution. So this application is for improvements to the Walloomsac Riverwalk pathway. The current pathway was originally completed in 1980, and then certain improvements were made in the 90s. And right now, you know, there've been a lot of great community participation thinking about the Riverwalk and the improvements that we want to make. So the timing is great for both the community involvement. The Better Bennington Corporation has done an extensive scoping study to look at these improvements, and they include widening the current path to be, in most sections, up to 10 feet wide, to include both bike and pedestrian use. Also, the construction of a new pathway to connect to the rail trail that's being worked on right now. So there'll be a connection from the rail trail to the Riverwalk pathway. Also, installing new lighting along the Bennington Elementary section, which currently is the darkest part of the pathway, to improve safety, to improve visibility. Including some safety rails at the different bridge abutments to both increase safety and visual quality. More trash receptacles, new benches, to replace some of the trees that need to be replaced along the pathway, and to include 9 new signs along the Walloomsac Riverwalk. So this is the extent of the grant application, along with the scoping study that the BBC has done. And the resolution calls for the Select Board approving of agreeing to the grant agreement and having some matching funds. So the Select Board, in a previous discussion, there was a discussion about the lighting along the pathway, and so that has been added to the budget to do that section of lighting along the Bennington Elementary section. So that will be the match that the town will be supporting that goes with the application.
I move that we accept this grant application and sign it forthwith.
All right, do I have a second?
Second.
Excellent. All right, all those in favor?
Can discussion?
Yes, discussion.
Yes, so you're going to have to help me out, because I'm really in favor of this. But I'm also, you said that the 20% match will be the lighting. Can you give me some ballpark of the figures that we're talking about here?
Well, that cost for the lighting is around $25,000, I believe.
Okay, so I'm just trying to figure out the range.
The scope of the grant is, depending on other funds that could be available through our Pathways initiative.
Right.
The funds are that we could apply for are up to $200,000.
Gotcha.
So if we have enough match to go for the full $200,000, that would be $40,000 of a match.
Right.
And that includes all
That's
of these.
the information that I needed.
Okay.
I'm still very supportive of it. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? All right, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That's all of us. Okay, thank you very much.
Cat TV is celebrating 30 years of community media. Help support Cat TV's next 30 years by becoming a member today. Your membership will help us continue covering meaningful, local content. Thank you for supporting your local community media station.